All right. All right. First shot. See if I can get this off. Okay. All right. So we're moving now. So last time we met, we talked about grace. We talked about the church before that. So now we're going to kind of shift to what was originally part of the semester, which was the sacraments. Today we're going to just do sort of an overview of the sacraments. And then what I plan to do is we'll go through each sacrament each week. For the Eucharist, we'll spend 2 weeks, one as a sacrament, one as a sacrifice. And then at the end, what we're really trying to do is to live a sort of a sacramental spirituality where our life is centered in the sacraments. And so we'll talk about how to tie all that up, how to keep things from being too abstract, and how we kind of live with sort of a radical dependence on the sacraments. All right, so let's talk first about why we even need sacraments, okay? Now, remember when we talked about the catechism, when we talked about when we talked about the church, remember I said that one of the ways we could look at the church is the incarnation throughout time, right? And that's one of the reasons why we talk about it being the mystical body, how on Pentecost, Christ essentially took on a new body. And now this begins to make sense then if we extend that analogy a little further and think about, well, people who actually met Jesus when he was, turn this, not away from you, who met Jesus face to face. The sacraments are like those people who touch him, right? They're like, I just want to touch his tassel, or I just, Jesus, like yesterday's gospel, the day before, where he heals the blind, or heals a deaf man by, through a spittle, and all these ways of just reaching out and touching Christ, right? And so what we begin to then see is the sacraments as being these touches of Christ, right? And so remember that, and those touches always end up being physical touches, but often with like a spiritual effect, right? So, but so that you will know that the Son of Man has power to forgive sins, I command you, pick up your mat, rise, and walk, right? And so this connection between what's tangible, physical, and touchable to this spiritual healing, or this touch of our soul, right? This physical touch that goes, when Christ touches us, it touches us so deeply, it touches like the very core of who we are. And so, so this idea then of seeing the sacraments as these touches of Christ, right? And the Catechism says the church is made manifest to the world on the day of Pentecost by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. The gift of the Spirit ushers in a new era in the dispensation of the mystery, the age of the church, right? So this is all what we talked about when we talked about the church, during which Christ manifests, makes present, and communicates his work of salvation through the liturgy of his church until he comes, right? And so seeing the liturgy as these definitive ways in which we touch and are touched by Christ. In this age of the church, Christ now lives and acts in and with his church in a new way appropriate to this new age. He acts through the sacraments in what the common tradition of the East and the West calls the Sacramental Economy. And remember, economy, not in the sense of like how you manage your money, but household management, right? That's what the word economy actually means. This is the communication of the fruits of Christ's paschal mystery in the celebration of the church's sacramental liturgy. So one of the questions that will often come up is, okay, so why do we need sacraments, right? And the question always is, well, isn't what Christ did on the cross enough? And the answer to that question obviously is yes. But the question is, how do you get access to what he did on the cross? Like that's the question that only the Catholic Church can answer, right? Because that's why she exists, so that you can and I can get access to the fruit of his sacrifice on Calvary, right? And then we'll see when we talk about the Eucharist how that ultimately the whole sacrifice is tied up with the sacramental economy, and how when we talk about the Last Supper, right? The Last Supper is the way in which we know that Christ is even making a sacrifice, right? How would you know? How would you know? How would anyone know that what happened on the cross was a sacrifice unless he had said it was? And then the manner in which he sets up a liturgy around it, right? And so we'll talk more about that when we get to the Eucharist. But the point is that the way in which we get access to the fruits of Calvary is through the sacraments, and that's the way he set it up. Yes.
In this context, is there any difference between the liturgy and like the matter and form of the sacrament?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but in general, yes. So the liturgy will be the thing that wraps around the sacrament, right? That is meant to make it a full act of worship and make it more intelligible. But we'll talk about that when we get the matter and form in a few minutes. All right, so let's back up then and sort of talk about why we need sacraments. And I would ask the question, why do we even need the incarnation? Why does God have to become man? If not, because why couldn't he just say, well, you've been redeemed? And it's a spiritual healing and we're all good.
I think Venerable Fulton Sheen said, it's like you have the higher nature has to go down to the lower nature before the lower nature can go up. Like before the plant feeds the dog has to go eat the plant, something like that. I don't know. God has to become man before he has to take on human nature before the human nature can share in his divine nature.
Yeah, so the invitation is exactly right. So Kevin, the invitation into that shared divine life, which we've called sanctifying grace, the invitation first has to be a condescending on his part, right? But that condescending doesn't just happen in a spiritual way. It happens in a physical and tangible way because we are physical and tangible creatures, right? And so St. Thomas says, whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. So whenever we give something to someone, it's not enough just to give. We have to give in a way that they can receive, right? And so if I give something, something to someone, say in like the pharmacy, let's say the pharmacy gives you your medicine, right? And they give you those little childproof tops, and you're a child and you can't get into them, right? Well, have they given you anything except frustration, right? So what St. Thomas is saying is when something's received, it's received in the way that the receiver receives it, in the mode according to which the receiver. So we have to receive things physical and tangible, right? And that's part of sort of the economy of salvation, in that St. Paul says that his invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things he's made. So everything that God makes, ultimately, either in the natural realm or supernatural realm, has one purpose, right? And it's to reveal himself to us, right? Everything. So that's what that is really being able to, now we broaden this a little bit to talk about looking at things sacramentally, okay? And so this idea then of seeing things as sacraments is really important. And so I want to take a little bit of a little detour here just to talk about this for a second. So C.S. Lewis in his Meditations on a Tool Shed has a really kind of poignant way of pointing this out. It says, I was standing today in the dark tool shed. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door, there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light with the specks of dust floating in it was the most striking thing in the place. All right, so imagine this sort of being in this dark room, and this beam of light coming down, right? And you'd see it hitting the floor. And everything else was almost pitch black. All right, so he's looking at the beam, right? And he just sees it as a source of light. But then he decides, well, he's going to look along it. Then I moved so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no tool shed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside and beyond that 90-odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. Right? And so why is he talking about looking at and looking along? Looking along is to look at what things are actually pointing at, right? What they actually mean, right? So if I look along a beam all the way to the sun, what's the meaning of the sun? right? What is it there for? Is it just there? Is it nothing but, a star that's going to burn out eventually? Or is it meant to also be looked along as something else? All right. And so that's the sacramental way of looking at things, where I've used this example before about, if I ask you the question, why does the moon orbit the Earth? Connor, you can't answer this question because I know I've asked it before. Why does the moon orbit the Earth? Take a crack at it, anyone. Keegan's cheating a little bit too. He just doesn't remember it. So I mean, okay, so you guys are already cheating a little bit. I was waiting for somebody to say, well, because of gravity, right? But I think I've used this example way too many times now that, so the problem with because of gravity is how it, right? Confuses how with why, right? Like, if you remember, if everything God made was to reveal himself, the why becomes really important, right? Why things are the way they are, and what they point to, right? And you can come up with many different sort of sacramental meanings, right? Like Ryan already touched on one about how Mary, who is fully in our orbit, reflects the light of the sun, of her son, right? And in a lot of ways, as Mother of Mercy, she keeps the sun from scorching the earth too, because she spends time reflecting it rather than the sun beating on the earth the whole time, right? The same place in the earth. So, so the point is that if you were to ask most people, they would say the moon is nothing but a piece of the earth that, at some point was broken off when an asteroid hit it, insert, whatever explanation you want to use as to how it got there. But they never get to the point of, why does the moon exist? Why does it exist the way it exists? Why not just put it on a giant pole, plant it, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean with a giant pole sticking out, and the moon sit there? Like, why is there gravity? Why is there? So all of those questions, and they're meant to be answered in the sense of, like, that's contemplation, right? Where we contemplate reality, looking for its meaning and how it connects to God trying to reveal himself to us. All right. And that is the habit of looking at things sacramental. So see everything as a sign pointing to the maker, right? And to reveal something of the heart of the maker. But in sort of the culture we live in, especially when everything is kind of, it has this reductionist way of looking at the world, that's not done anymore. Okay. And so, so for example, right? Why do we eat meals the way we eat them? Why don't we just go put our feed bag on and go off in the corner like a horse and eat? Okay, we're not horses for sure. That's yeah. Okay, well then I'll throw so our mouths aren't structures for feed bags. Although never mind. So yeah, say that again, Connor. Yeah, because we're communal by nature, right? And why is it so important for families to share meals? Yeah, so there's a little bit of bonding, but so can you survive without eating? When you share a meal with someone, is it a form of sharing your life? Right? Like, if you're sharing sustenance for your life. So not surprisingly, families that eat meals together tend to be closer, right? Because they've had these moments of bonding in which they've maybe not definitively understood, but that the meal itself has a purpose other than it's not nothing but, shoving my pie hole so that I have enough energy to get through the next 4 hours, right? Humans do things in a very unique way because everything is meant to point to something else. Okay. There are no merely biological acts when it comes to us. Okay. Everything has a meaning. And you can insert, other examples, right? Like, I mean, that whole like contraceptive culture is rooted in just seeing it as a biological act, right? Scratching an itch, rather than seeing it as, looking at a man's body, looking at a woman's body as sacraments, right? Of self-giving, and then seeing it in that light changes everything. Okay. So that is the way we have to start looking at creation, right? In order to grasp why God uses sacraments. Okay, all right, does that make sense? All right, so getting to see things as signs makes seeing the sacramental order a little clearer. But there's a big difference between just seeing things as signs and sacraments. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. So one of the things that I'm sort of talking about, right? I said that God made everything to reveal himself to us, right? In either the natural order or the supernatural order. So they both have the same purpose, right? And because they have the same purpose, they have this sort of natural connection with each other or natural analogy, okay? And St. Thomas was really big about using analogy, right? So I think we talked about this when we talked about God last semester. So can I say anything positive about God? Like when I say God is love, does that tell you anything definitive? No, why not? Yeah, so God is, so our experience of love, our definition of love, God is way more, right? And if I say to you, God is Father, can you tell me what that means exactly? Right? No, right? Because God is everything that's good in an earthly father and way, way more, right? And so this notion of analogy is what, because you can only say what God is not, right? You can say, God is infinite. That means he doesn't have any bounds. God is all powerful. That means he doesn't have any weakness, right? But what St. Thomas does is he uses analogies so that we can say something sort of positive about God, something that is definitive about God, right? And you can see people often fall into the trap of forgetting that they're analogies, right? So the classic example is like, what kind of father would let their kid get run over by a car and not stop something, right? You've heard that kind of explanation about like, well, God, why does God allow bad things to happen, right? If he's really a father, why does he allow, right? And that's putting the image before the thing that it's imaging, right? And so understanding this idea of analogy is really important because it helps us to see what God is and what he isn't. So when you use an analogy, you can say just as much about what God is and than what he isn't. But it also helps us to understand the sacraments, right? And why we have 7 of them. And so St. Thomas uses this idea of analogy by drawing a parallel between our natural lives and our supernatural life, right? So in our natural life, a full life, we're born, right? In supernatural life, are we born? In baptism, right? In our natural life, we grow to a certain level of maturity. Do we grow to a certain level of maturity, and is that maturity marked in the supernatural life? Confirmation. In the natural life, we need to eat in order to survive and to keep life in us. Is there something we need in the supernatural life to do that? Yeah, the bread of life, right? And we get sick in the natural life, and we need to go and get healing. And so, do we have such a thing in the supernatural life? Yeah, so we have penance, right? And we have anointing of the sick, right? And in a lot of ways, if we look at anointing of the sick, and we'll talk more about this when we get to it, more as a strengthening against sin rather than a forgiving of sin. Yes.
I think we'll probably talk about this later, but is anointing the sick the same thing as last rites?
Yes, it's the same thing. Even though it's abused.
Okay, so that's, yes, there's a really.
And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. All right, so then all of these sort of steps along the natural life are found in the supernatural life, right? But we're not just individuals, we're social creatures, right? And so we need to, just as you need to propagate in the natural life, how do you grow the supernatural society that is the church? To the sacrament of marriage, right? That's where the domestic church, which is the foundation of the church, it's like just as the family is the foundation of society, the domestic church is the foundation of the church. And like any society, it needs governance. And so we have holy orders, right? And so there's this parallel between the natural life and the supernatural life, right? And what's important is that we grasp why there's not just why there's 7, but what happens if you take some out, right? They're a package deal, right? Some part of growth or something necessary for supernatural life goes out the window, right? And that's what's happened, with the Protestants. Essentially, when they threw out one sacrament, they ended up more or less throwing all of them out. Okay, and that's why we have 7, because it hits, not just because God really likes 7, but because it hits every aspect of life, right? It hits every aspect of the supernatural life and leads to its growth and protection. Okay, so that's just the sort of the why, right? And now we're going to talk about what sacraments are. Yes.
We're going to talk about this more in depth later, but I know in the East, I'm not sure if it's just the Eastern Orthodox or they say Eastern Rite Catholics will do confirmation and baptism at the same time. Is there a purpose for that? Is there a reason we don't do it? Is it just... Yeah,
so what we're going to talk about this when we talk about confirmation, but now confirmation is, it in the analogy, limps a little bit because it isn't really the bestowal of, like, it's not saying you're mature, but graces from sacraments can end up bound, and we get them when we need them, right? So think about marriage is the easiest one so like when you get the sacramental graces, which we'll talk about just in general in a minute, of marriage, right? Those cover your entire marriage, right? And so you're kind of always tapping into the reserve, right? And so confirmation is a lot like that. And so it can be given at any age. And if the person is in a state of grace, the actual graces or the sacramental graces can end up bound until they need them, right? Because ultimately one of the graces is the grace of martyrdom, right? And so when that moment comes, the grace of confirmation will like activate, right? All right. So one of the things that's often misunderstood about sacraments is just people will sort of overly see them as signs. Okay. All right. So everyone sees the stop sign, right? Does the stop sign bring about the thing it signifies? Or is it just a sign telling you you should stop? Okay, so what if the stop sign actually, if you tried to run it, it reached out and made you stop? Put up a brick wall. What if a brick wall went up when it went up? There's that. Would that be just a sign, or would that be a sacrament? Right. So in the truest sense of the word, it would be a sacrament, right? So it would be a sign signifying the thing that it's going to do, the power it's going to do, and actually being the cause of stopping. So in other words, you don't stop on your own; it stops you. Okay. And so we have to see sacraments not just as signs, but things that actually have their own causation and cause the thing that they signify. All right. Yes.
So I was going to ask about this. So we talk about a sacrament, we're saying it's not the grace that's given, it's the cause of the grace. Is it just the? But it's not. Is it just the sign? Is it the, so like take baptism, like the material and formal cause of baptism? You said have water and have the words.
The water and the words cause your sanctification. They are the causes of them.
They form something that is in the cause.
Yes, they are the cause of your, like, baptism now saves you. When St. Peter says that, he literally means it, right? Because baptism saves you. The act of the water mixed with the words saves you. It's its own form of causation, right? And that's why the stop sign would be literally have to stop you, and it would be the thing that stops you, right? No brakes in your car, nothing. The stop sign just stops you for it to be a sacrament. Yes.
So like a railroad thing where it like puts the arm down, like that would still just be a sign.
Yes, that would still be so that would be, and we'll talk about this when we get to it, that would be like an Old Testament sacrament. So it would be, so the Old Testament sacrament, we'll come back to this. The Old Testament sacrament is the occasion. It happens that you stop because of it, right? And I'll talk more about it when we get to the Old Testament sacraments. But yeah, they didn't actually cause you to stop, right? It wasn't the cause of your stopping. And so the distinctly then Catholic way of understanding this, the Protestants with the Protestant Reformation began to see sacraments as nothing but signs. So they would say that that is that sign, that stopping is a sacrament. It's just a sign that you're supposed to stop. Yes. Yeah, because once you throw out one, like it's with most things in the church, right? They're seamless, they're sort of the seamless garment. But yeah, because now a whole aspect of life is no longer under supernatural power. All right, so yes.
Are there marriages actually? Are there like Protestants marriages still sacraments? Or are they...
Yes. So any marriage between two baptized people is a sacrament because they're the ministers.
What if they don't have proper understanding?
Well, now that's like subjective disposition. How the grace falls upon them is different, but they still objectively have received the sacrament of marriage.
So what if they walked in and were like, because for instance, like pre-K, you get asked, do you lifelong covenant dissolvable in my death? I think there would probably be, maybe not all, but there are definitely Protestants who would say, well, it's lifelong covenant dissolvable by death or divorce. So if they don't have proper understanding, does that mean that they didn't actually contract a valid marriage?
It could mean that. All right, so sacraments then are more than just signs, okay? They're actually causes of our sanctification, all right? All right, so let's get some definitions so we've covered why, and then now let's cover what are they. Sacraments are powers that come forth from the body of Christ. All right. So again, that idea we talked about at the beginning of this sort of way in which we touch Christ and Christ touches us, which is ever living and life-giving. They are actions of the Holy Spirit at work in his body, the church. They're the masterworks of God and the new and everlasting covenants. So this definition is more about what they do than what they are, right? So that it talks about them being actions of the Holy Spirit at work, by which the new and everlasting covenant, we become part of it and renew it, and that their powers to come forth. So certainly tying back to Christ's own use of sacraments, let's see if we can get a little bit more solid definition. All right, so paragraph 1131 says the sacraments are efficacious signs of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church by which divine life is dispensed to us. The visible rites by which the sacraments are celebrated signify and make present the graces proper to each sacrament. They bear fruit in those who receive them with the required dispositions. All right, so three sort of necessary conditions. They have to have been instituted by Christ. They have to have some visible sign, and they have to give grace. And by graces, they mostly mean sanctifying grace, although there are actual graces and what are called sacramental graces, which we'll talk about. And then again, the visible rites by which the sacraments are celebrated signify and make present the graces proper to each sacrament. So let's talk about when it talks about the power, what it means. This is the means of the church's affirmation that the sacraments act ex operato, which literally means by the very fact of the actions being performed. So the sacraments are objectively what they are, right? Doesn't matter whether the person believes it or not. Doesn't matter really, even if the minister believes it or not, right? He just has to will to do what the church wants to do, right? And so even somebody who doesn't believe in baptism, baptizing someone with the intent of baptizing them is a valid baptism, right? And it really bestows sanctifying grace. Yes?
Why do the words matter?
Yeah, so the words, which we'll talk about in a second, are what give it form. So say what it is, right? So just putting a child in water is a bath, right? But if I say those words, the water becomes the actual cause of the sanctification. So the matter becomes something else, right? So form always determines what the matter is. So it's the words that make it no mere water, right? Like it's Christ's words that make the bread and wine no mere bread and wine. And so the words matter because That's the instituted by Christ part. They're not the priest's words, they're his words. Right? He says them. And so that's why they matter. All right, so literally means by the very fact of the actions being performed by virtue of the saving work of Christ, accomplished once for all, it follows that the sacrament is not wrought by the righteousness of either the celebrant or the recipient, but by the power of God. From the moment that a sacrament is celebrated in accordance with the intention of the church, the power of Christ and his spirit acts in and through it independently of the personal holiness of the minister. Right, and so it's all of what we just said. The other part that is really important, though, and this is more of a challenge for us on the sort of the receiving end, is to not see them as somehow magic, right? Where magic would be, well, the Eucharist happens and I eat the Eucharist, so therefore I am sanctified. Full stop, right? Our subjective disposition in receiving the sacraments absolutely matters, right? And think about confession. If I go in there and I have no sorrow, did I receive the grace of confession? Was the grace still there objectively in when the priest says the words of absolution? Yes, but it didn't fall on me, right? So there has to be some action on my part to receive it, okay? And we can often treat the sacraments as magical. We're like, well, at least he's receiving the sacraments, right? And that's not sufficient, okay? And so our disposition absolutely matters. It doesn't, this is where it differs from Protestantism though, but it doesn't change the fact that that the Eucharist is objectively the body and blood of Christ. Whether I believe it, whether I receive it in a state of grace or not, it still is what it is, all right? When those words are said over bread and wine, they cease to be bread and wine, right? And so they are objectively what they are, regardless of what I believe, right? And we talked about how, in a certain sense, for Protestants, most of a lot of what they have faith in their own faith, right? They're trusting that their own faith is genuine. Yes.
So this might be a little more specific, but so you priests, so you said any bread and wine said over, obviously they have to actually be bread and they have to actually be wine. And I've heard that, or I know that priests who are, for whatever reason, not supposed to be saying the mass, they can still technically do it because they have the power, like within them. Is that the same with penitents? I feel like I've heard things where like they won't have faculties or something like that if they are not.
Yeah, so they still have the power to forgive sins. If they don't have faculties, there's a question. So the difference between like valid and licit, right? Licit means lawful. Valid means is it really a sacrament? And so a priest who doesn't have faculties, for example, or had them stripped, which usually is a little bit different, right? That confession might not be licit unless he had a really good reason for doing like an emergency, like someone was, in danger of death or something, right? But he never loses that power to forgive sins in this like case of emergency, right? And the same thing with the mass too, right? Like a priest might not licitly say mass, but he can still the sacrament can still be valid. So a priest has to have, for example, like a simple thing that, I mean, it doesn't mean the priest is bad or anything. If he goes into a diocese, he's supposed to have the bishop's permission to say mass in that diocese. And if he neglects to, then the mass may be illicit, meaning not legal, but again, like, and it can obviously get worse if someone has been laicized or something like that. But in general, though, a priest even going into another diocese could hear your confession if it had to be done. Otherwise, what he normally would do is say, I don't have faculties, can you go to X priest or something, or give you some kind of conditional absolution until you got to another priest or something. So let's just put some terms here just so we have them, because we'll come back to this when we talk about the Old Testament sacraments and Sacramentals. So the fruits of the sacraments, right? What they do in us also depend on the disposition of the one who receives them, right? So we already said that. The two terms, ex opere operato, means by the work performed. That just pertains to the fact that sacraments are what they are because Christ said so, right? And if we do whatever in memory of him, and we do it the way he said, then they objectively are what they are. And then ex opere operantis simply just means according to the recipient, right? So it's sort of two-way street. And we'll talk more about that in a second when we get to sacramentals. All right, so matter and form, sort of along the lines of Aaron's question. Every sacrament consists of two things: matter, which is called the element, and form, which is commonly called the word. This is the doctrine of the fathers of the church, and the testimony of St. Augustine on the subject is familiar to all. The word, he says, is joined to the element and it becomes a sacrament. So a reality is formed when form and matter meet. Okay, that's by the word, sensible thing. Therefore, the fathers understand not only the matter or elements such as water and baptism, all of which fall under the eye, but also the words which constitute the form and which are addressed to the ear. Okay, so what they're saying is that the words themselves, that even though they constitute the form, are still signs, right? Are still visible things we can touch or hear or feel, such as water and all of which fall into the eye, but also the words which constitute the form and which are addressed to the ear. In order to make the meaning of the rite that is being performed, and this is where we'll talk about your question, Connor, that is being performed easier and clear, words had to be added to the matter. For of all signs, words are evidently the most significant, and without them, what the matter for the sacraments designates and declares would be utterly obscure. All right, so backing up. So matter is just that part of the sacrament which something is done to in order to confer grace, right? So think about the water in baptism, chrism in confirmation, bread and wine in the Eucharist. So that's the matter. The form is the sacramental sign that the words the words specify, right? And so in baptism, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, with and the Holy Spirit. That Trinitarian formula is the form, all right? So it essentially creates a new reality in the sacramental realm, but nevertheless, that water with the words becomes a cause of sanctifying grace in the soul and all the other effects of baptism.
How do translations work with form?
I mean, there is some liberty there. For instance, there are differences, obviously, in languages and translations, and which is, again, one reason why having universal language, if only the church had a universal language that they could use, that you didn't have to worry about translations, but hopefully someday someone will come up with that and use it. It'd be great. There is obviously some leeway there in that the faith of the church and the intent of the minister carries a lot of weight. So if there's a mispronunciation of a word in the formula for the consecration, not a big deal. If the priest regularly changes the words, that could be a problem, right? And I was going to say, like, for us, we probably need to be not get hung up on it, though. Obviously, if something is pretty egregious, I would just go to mass somewhere else, right? Or it's very clear, you go into confession and it really doesn't say the words of absolution. Well, go to another priest, right? What are we going to say?
So I guess, yeah, so with that, there's that story of that priest in Chicago, that a priest didn't baptize him correctly, so he couldn't have been ordained, so all the people he did. So that's like kind of the proper sacramental logic of, well, he wasn't, in order to be ordained, you have to be
Baptized.
In order to this, you have to be ordained, or to be ordained, you have to be baptized, and he wasn't. So what do we say happened to all the sacraments just about? We just kind of say, okay, well, God took care of it in providence, and
well, I mean, so all of those people that he baptized, if he didn't use a Trinitarian formula, were not validly baptized. Now, how God sorts that out, I mean, I don't know. Yes.
Just like for something like salvation or whatever we can say, like God's not bound by the sacrament. But for something like Connor's example, it wouldn't be done anyway. Like he wouldn't be baptized through God's just direct action if the sacrament is invalid.
Right. So God can give the grace of baptism without without baptism, right? So he's not, to Keegan's point, God's not bound by the sacraments, right? We are. And that's why as soon as they found out, they did something about it, right? And hopefully they can remedy some of the other ones, although I don't know if they'll get everybody, right? But there is also, those who like they don't get to and say, hey, look, you haven't been validly baptized, or they didn't know. There is, something akin to like a baptism of the desire going on, right? And so God's not going to punish them for what they didn't know. And in his providence, if they're supposed to be baptized like that priest, then they'll find out. If not, then God will sort it out. You just don't want to be the priest that actually did that, though, because that's a little different, right? I'm sure God will sort that out too. All right, so form then is just the sort of the sacramental sign or the words that specify what's going on. All right, so there's two other things that sort of make the sacrament visible. The first is the minister, which we'll talk about a lot more when we get to individual sacraments. The other is the liturgy around it. All right, and so the liturgy, think of the liturgy as this sort of adornment or sign that makes the sign more intelligible. Right? So the liturgy ought to make whatever the sacrament being done more intelligible to the senses. So we're more aware of what's going on, and it ought to dispose us better to receive the sacrament. All right. And so the way a mass is conducted doesn't change the objective reality that the Eucharist, that Christ is really present on the altar at the moment of consecration. But the way the liturgy is conducted certainly changes the way in which it's pleasing to God as an act of worship, and the way it's received by the people in the pew, and the manner in which the priest also receives it, right? And so the liturgy itself actually matters, right? It's not something we should be regularly tinkering with, although the sacraments can't be changed, right? They were instituted by Christ. The liturgy is a little more organic, right? And so the church can change the liturgy or make it, that's why you have different rites with the liturgy slightly different, is because in different cultures, it's more intelligible if the liturgy is this way versus that way. Yes?
Yeah, so like with the last thing you're saying, what is the response when people are like, oh, well, I'm better able to enter into the mass if it's done in this way that I like? Is it like, is that the sort of thing that has to come through the church to say that?
Yeah, so only like the church on a universal level, or at least from the perspective of the different rites, can make changes to it. So the rubrics are what they are, and no one else is, whether this person likes this thing or this priest likes to do it this way, like all of that, it goes far beyond what they're supposed to do, right? Yes, right.
You're actually not in really but for most of the sacraments, I can kind of track the matter is confession. There's not a particular.
Yeah, the matter is your sins, right?
Okay.
And then the form is just I absolve you. Yeah, and some of them, just to be clear, Ryan, like some of them, like matrimony, not real clear what the matter and form is. Like the church hasn't even just really said what the matter and form are. They know it's sort of what the form is, but what the matter is not always entirely clear.
The sacrament of like the Eucharist or Holy Communion, that is not the same thing as the Mass, correct?
Right. Yeah. So the Mass, in and of it's, this is why like we're going to break it up into sacrifice versus sacrament, right? Like technically speaking, the Mass is the liturgy around the sacrament of the Eucharist. So they're distinct, although they become almost nearly synonymous, right? It's when you combine them as sacrament and sacrifice.
So is the sacrament the consecration or the reception?
That is a little bit like a contended question, but a sacrament, technically speaking, the sacrament is in the consecration, right? Because it's objectively the sacrament. Now, have you received the sacrament without receiving the Eucharist, right? And that would be the question, that in most cases, no, I haven't actually received the sacrament. But again, because it's a sacrifice, it's pleasing to God, like you still, and it's, for the sake of the whole church, you still receive grace from it. And so that's a little bit like a sort of a complicated.
And I guess to a certain degree, we could say it's not the reception, because if it was the reception, they could not have changed like the liturgy behind the reception.
Yeah, and you couldn't. So, for example, if it was the reception, like you would have to receive one way and one way only, and presumably the way that the apostles did. And now, should you receive one way and one way only? Yes, but we won't go into that yet. All right, so the liturgy then, like when I go to the liturgy, a good liturgy is one that makes clear what's going on and makes it easy for me to be disposed to receive whatever the sacrament is. Yes, sir.
So if the church that's your home parish based off of distance has a really bad liturgy, it's difficult to pray in that mass, and another church has a really good liturgy that's farther away. Is it better to just go to Sunday mass at your home parish with a bad liturgy, or make the drive? Or is it okay to go to a different church?
I would say, which is more pleasing to God, a good liturgy or a bad liturgy? Which would you rather do? Please God more or less? That's the answer to your question, right? Now, if again, that's not to like if objectively anyone would walk in there and go, this is a really bad liturgy. If there's certain aspects of it that, like I really like the way the priest turns his back on me to wash his hands. Like that's a little ridiculous, right? But if it has to be like objective, like, yeah, that liturgy is not well done, then certainly that would be valid. I mean, you got to use a little bit of common sense, but especially now, like, so here's my question. This will get me off on a little tangent, but I think it's okay. What is the greatest sin being perpetuated today? Anyone know? I won't say that, so go to that, but what is the greatest sin being committed today? Well, I mean, I have a really good idea.
Attacks against the Eucharist.
Yes. It's like most people would answer abortion, and because I raised in this, I'm sure that came to mind, right? But the worst sin being committed is desecration of the Eucharist, right? And so when that is going on regularly, and it's from top down, and we can talk about this when we get to the Eucharist, we have an obligation to support priests and liturgies that are really well done. And everything we possibly can to do to get to those, we should do. All right. And again, within reason. And you don't not go to mass because, like, again, that's just my opinion. You don't not go to mass or not receive because the liturgy was really poorly done. But if I have the choice between a really well done liturgy and one that's not, and that's not about me, that's because I want to be associated with something that's more pleasing to God. Okay. And we know objectively what's pleasing to God because the church has told us. All right. And we'll talk more about, especially the Eucharist, we'll talk more about that. All right. All right, so let's talk about what grace we receive with the sacraments, all right? The grace conferred by the valid and fruitful reception of the sacrament may be one or more of several kinds. The first, sanctifying grace, is communicated in baptism, penance, and anointing of the sick when needed. All right, so going back to, we talked last time about what sanctifying grace was. It's given to us in baptism, but restored to us if we lose it in confession and maybe anointing of the sick. Okay. Yes.
So you said anointing the sick and last rite is the same thing. The last rite is anointing the sick contain two other sacraments as well, or are those sacraments just given in addition to?
No, like what do you mean? Like
I thought last rites consisted of like they hear your confession, they give you anointing, they give you back. And I thought those were like you get 3 sacraments. Is that not correct?
I guess you like it just depends on that's I think like a semantic thing. Like that's 3 sacraments, right? Mm-hmm. So anointing of the sick can forgive mortal sin, right? If the person wanted to receive the sacrament and was unconscious, for example, right? And they desired to receive the sacrament, they received it. and then they came back too, then they'd have to go to confession, right? But it has the power to forgive mortal sin. And then sanctifying grace is always increased when a sacrament is received in the state of grace. So all the other sacraments, the Eucharist, holy orders, matrimony. Did I leave one out? No, that's it, right? Confirmation. Those are all what are called sacraments of the living, and they increase sanctifying grace in those. Okay. And then actual grace is given by all the sacraments, either actually at the time of reception or also by title as a person needs divine help. Yes.
So you mentioned the sacraments living, and we know that the Eucharist receiving that sacrament in the same morsel is not a good thing. It's another morsel. Is that the same with all the other sacraments? Are all the other sacraments living?
Yes. So somebody, it's still an act of desecration, right? Like to receive matrimony, for example, like in a state of mortal sin would still be a desecration.
Now, do they work? Like, if you got married, is there a morsel you still actually get married?
Yes. So that they are what they are. And then certain sacraments, the graces end up bound up until you're ready to receive them.
So it'd be like holy orders, confirmation, matrimony, all that.
Yeah.
Work, but they would just be
Yes. So think of it like it's like laying dormant in your soul, which is kind of what it's talking about. Yeah, actual grace is given by all the other sacraments, either actually at the time of reception or as also by title as a person needs divine help. So by title meaning when marriage is a good example, when a couple exchanges the vows, God gives all of the actual graces that they will need for their vocation. But in essence, he gives them a right to all of the graces because grace doesn't just sort of hang around, right? And what that means, practically speaking, is that God more or less puts himself on the hook to give you grace when you need it, right? So a couple gets married and then say they go through some sort of family struggle and it's really hard and they need grace. God has made it so that he owes them grace, right? He has promised in the sacrament, right? And that's we'll talk about in a second about seeing sacraments as covenants is really important because it's this bond that God makes with us. So, and it's like a familial bond in which the father then owes the son what he needs. And so that's the idea. Yes, Ryan.
So with marriage as an example, say a couple is sex outside of marriage and then they get married, well, because they're in a state of mortal sin before they get married, are they not able to provide him better access?
Yeah, they'd have to go to confession to get access to those graces. But they still objectively received the sacrament. They just didn't receive the grace at the time. Yes.
So if a grace is given and denied, is it like gone sort of thing, or is it like put on for later? So like you receive the Eucharist and like you just don't accept the graces given. Is it like stored up or?
No, and so in that case, like with the Eucharist, if the grace was visited upon you and you didn't take it, it's gone. Now, what God actually does with those, I don't know if he has like a storehouse in heaven that he pours on people later, but in essence, when the grace was needed, if you didn't ask for it or didn't receive it, it's no longer available to you. So, all right, so actual grace is given, and then a sacramental character is indelibly imprinted on the soul in baptism, confirmation, and the priesthood. So we'll talk more about this when we talk about those sacraments, but this idea of sacramental character is essentially like a badge placed upon our souls that is there regardless of whether we sin or not. It's there forever. And it marks us, and it's really like, think of it more as like a badge, like deputizing us to do certain things. And it is what allows us, for example, if we've been baptized and we fall into a state of mortal sin, it's what enables us when we go to confession to have the sanctifying grace restored. All right, so that mark allows grace to be restored, right? And then I think might be St. John Vianney, or it's either him or St. Alphonsus Liguori talks about how how the sacramental characters increase the suffering in hell, right? Because the demons can see it, especially the one for priests, and they torment especially those who have that character. And then each sacrament has a distinctive sacramental grace that's imparted by each of the 7 sacraments, corresponding to their respective purpose in the supernatural life of the soul. And we'll talk more about that. But there are, again, the classic one is confirmation, right? The grace of martyrdom is there. That is unique to that sacrament, grace to witness.
The ontological, or the change in precept, I've heard it called an ontological change. What does that actually?
Yeah, so ontological is just a philosophical word for being. Like when you receive baptism, you become something like metaphysically different than you were before, right? And same with the priesthood. You're no longer just this mortal human being. You are a priest, like, and a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek, right? Like that's the idea. So a new reality is born, right?
You still have the same nature.
Yes, but you have different, but it in some way is, in some way your soul is there, like that indelible mark is on your soul, right? And this is why the church doesn't teach necessarily that that you also receive a character in marriage, although they haven't closed that question or not. But this is one of the reasons why marriage is indissoluble, because a new reality comes into being when a couple is married, right? All right, so that's all right. So let's talk a little bit about. We already talked about the character. We talked about. Let's see. All right, let's talk a little bit about covenant, the idea of a covenant, and then we'll talk about Old Testament sacraments, and then we'll finish with sacramentals. Okay, so in Latin, the word for oath is sacramentum, which is where we eventually get the term sacrament from. And the Hebrew word for covenant is shavah, which is really literally means to seven yourself, means to swear or to make an oath. And so throughout the Old Testament, we find the notion of covenant, right? And there are 7 covenants made, right? Starting with Adam, moving through Abraham and Moses and David, and then all the way up to Christ. And these covenants are essentially have certain aspects to them, right? Where they form this sort of familial bond between God and his people. And they also require that they be renewed, right? And so this is why Christ uses the language of covenant at the Last Supper, right? And so covenants are, you often hear sacraments be called signs of the covenant. And so what was the way that that the Jews entered into the covenant with God? Does anyone know? Circumcision, right? Circumcision, right? And how do Catholics enter into covenant with God? Baptism. And so St. Paul, in his sort of diatribe on why they don't need to be circumcised any longer, says that baptism is the new circumcision, right? Which is one of the arguments which we'll talk about next week when we talk about baptism, for infant baptism, right? That the entering into the covenant, the parents doing that has sort of this biblical tradition. All right, so they gathered at Jerusalem in the 3rd month of the 15th year of Asa's reign and sacrificed to the Lord on that day 700 oxen and 7,000 sheep from the spoils they had brought. They entered into a covenant to seek the Lord, the God of their ancestors, with all their heart and soul. And everyone who would not seek the Lord, the God of Israel, was to be put to death, from least to the greatest, man or woman. They swore an oath to the Lord with a loud voice, with shouting and with trumpets. All Judah rejoiced over the oath, for they had sworn it with their whole heart and sought him with a complete desire. The Lord was found by them and gave them rest on every side. And so from the very beginning of creation, right, God makes covenants with mankind, right? And there's always sort of a couple of things involved in that. There's the way to enter into the covenant, and there's always priests in the covenant, right? Like Adam is the first priest. And so all the way down. So each covenant normally brought with it a new priesthood or some modification to the priesthood, and some way in which to renew the covenant or to sort of swear the oath again. Okay. All right. So let's talk about Old Testament sacraments. All right. So these signs are signs pointing to other signs, right? Which is a good way for us to sort of grasp what the Old Testament sacraments are. They're signs of the signs. And so the way we tend to read the Old Testament sacraments is as if they are just these rituals, right? But these sacraments themselves are these efficacious signs. But in the Old Testament, they were a little bit different, okay? So there's no difference in like Luther and Calvin's mind between the Old Testament sacraments and the New Testament sacraments. So so think about for a second. Let's see if we can grasp what's going on with this. So Moses, right? You know the story of Moses hitting the rock, right? And he doesn't enter the promised land because he hits the rock twice. Why is that? Yeah, so what was God trying to do through Moses there? What was actually going on there? Yeah, so does that sound like, right? So St. Paul says the rock was Christ. Does that sound like a sacrament? Where he uses words and with some visible sign and the water flows. Right? And so what did Moses do? He missed the sacramental meaning of what he was doing, right? And so the rock and the staff are the matter, and Moses's words were supposed to be the form. Right? So you see this sort of encapsulation of sacraments, right? So if that's true, right, why throughout the Old Testament is God so meticulous about the way sacrifices are done, the way liturgies are done? Why is he so meticulous? Yeah, because they're supposed to be signs, right? So that was supposed to be a sign, right? That was supposed to be a sign. And so God has to chastise Moses and let everyone know what the sign actually was, right? And he corrects it later. And then the same thing with, we talked about this, I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago about, having, when we run into Leviticus and Numbers, we're like, okay, this is dizzying. Like, why does the priest have to stand on his left foot while he's holding his right hand in the air? And, why are all these things the way they are? And it's because they were meant to be signs pointing to the New Testament, especially the New Testament sacraments. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the law of Moses. All right, so the law of Moses has 3 parts. All right, so Christ said, what about the law of Moses again? He came to what? Not abolish, but fulfill. All right, so the law of Moses has 3 parts to it. All right, the first are the moral precepts. And they pertain to the natural moral law and the 10 commandments. All right, so did Christ abolish the moral law and the 10 commandments? No. How did he fulfill them? Yeah, say that again. Like, that's so important.
By writing them on our heart.
Yeah, so writing them out. So now the 10 commandments become almost prophetic, right? You shall not kill. He makes us into the kinds of people who don't do those kinds of things, right? So he now empowers us. So he fulfills the moral precepts of the old law. And so they still all apply to us, but now in a fashion in which we fulfill them, right? And then the ultimate fulfillment is in the Beatitudes, right? Ceremonial precepts are the second part of the Mosaic law. And those are regulations regarding the celebration of feasts and liturgical law. Did he abolish those? In what way?
So I think you could say those things are pointing towards the new which you've been created. They're pointing towards like the liturgy of the church, or more specifically the
So if I were to bail you out, in order to fulfill them, they were naturally abolished, right?
the imperfect passed away and the perfect.
Yes. And then the judicial or juridical laws are divinely sanctioned civil law that determine how the moral law should be enforced in ancient Israel. Right? And so those include things like stoning, right? Those things were not meant to be necessarily followed for eternity, but the offense, adultery, for example, was always going to be wrong. The way it was handled would be different. Okay. All right, so back to the ceremonial precepts. Those essentially have two purposes, which was already sort of hinted at. They are meant to give us, or at least show that there's this divinely given form of worship that consecrates the people and sets them apart. And then they're also meant to be a type of the New Testament sacraments. So let's just talk about them then. All right, so it might be easier to talk about this just kind of question and answer kind of way. So circumcision, does it give sanctifying grace? How did the people of the Old Testament get sanctifying grace? Anyone know? Well, so they had okay, so let's back that up. So Connor says they didn't. Who agrees with that? So because without sanctifying grace, what don't they get? Yeah. So are we willing to say that everybody coming before Christ is in hell, or at least in limbo? That would even be nice. All right. No, I'm pretty sure it was recorded. Connor said, no, amend your answer.
They have no instituted way.
Okay, I would agree with that. I would agree that there was no instituted way. So, all right, we all agree that if they did have sanctifying grace, that it came from Christ. Everybody agree with that, right? So by merit of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, if they had sanctifying grace, it was only because of him. All right. So then, what was circumcision then? What is the relationship? What does circumcision have to do with sanctifying grace? Anything? How many of you guys think that it somehow disposed them to receiving sanctifying grace? So what does that sound like now that we have? Anyone know what sacramentals are? Does it sound sort of like that? All right. So what St. Thomas says is that the Old Testament sacraments were merely the occasions of the bestowal, especially he picks circumcision. So were the occasions by which they received sanctifying grace. How is that different from baptism? Not the cause. That's so like that aspect of it, right? Now we begin to see, okay, just what really is going on with baptism. Baptism actually causes sanctification, right?
So the difference is God would have just given that grace at the same time as the circumcision.
Yes, right, because they are signs of faith. See, this is what people think our sacraments are when they're not. They're not sign. Baptism is not. This is what Protestants always say. They're like, well, you get baptized to show that you've, right? That's circumcision. Like circumcision was a sign that I'd accepted like the gift of faith. That's not baptism. That's an Old Testament sacrament, right? That, baptism is not just the occasion by which I receive grace. It actually caused it. And so there's no power in circumcision to give grace. It's just the occasion or the sign that God has bestowed on it. Yes.
So not to be awkward or anything, but women can't be circumcised.
Yeah, they were left out. It was a shame. So, women,
Genuine question.
yeah, no, it's a fair question. So women would have received the same exact thing at their naming, is what most of the Old Testament, the rabbis said that they received. They received entrance into the covenant when they were named, because naming was the acceptance by their father who was circumcised. So the familial aspect of Judaism is like, it's a very real sort of thing that the father really covered the entire family. So yes, they still were part of the covenant, but they just entered it differently, right? Because, like, again, go into the meaning. Why circumcision? Why hit a guy there? Like, well, I mean, God is he's the first one he makes do that, right? So it does have something to do with that.
It's like because he had lot, he didn't trust God, and like therefore he couldn't, not hidden, but like justice was enacted in the same equal and opposite.
Yeah, so that's the sort of the genesis of it. I hate to use like Genesis, but what they really believe, like, where do we get original sin from? From Adam, right? And they said, okay, well, original sin is transmitted through the flesh from Adam, right? And so they hit Adam where literally where it hurts, but yeah, but at the place that, where it's caused, so that it would stop the flow of original sin from father to child. The sign of that, how God stopped that. What were we going to say, Keaton?
I don't know how important it is, but it's like the original sin isn't actually transmitted through the flesh; it's through his authority. Correct.
Yeah. So that, again, remember, like, as the understanding of original sin sort of advances too, right? It's not something they would have seen it as something transmitted, but it's really not transmitted. It's just a result of our fallen condition. We don't have sanctifying grace, and human nature, the woundedness of human nature is transmitted, but from both parents, right?
And so like circumcision wouldn't be like, oh, that fixes it, but that's a sign in the way in which the familial structure happens. And like, so same thing with the naming of the woman.
Yes, it's a sign,
There's no doubt.
yeah, that original sin has not been passed on. Like, so it almost renders the man a sign that the man has been rendered incapable of giving original sin to his child, but not an actual cause of it, and it's not actually, it's just the occasion. I got it right here.
So St. Thomas talks about, I think specifically he's talking about, like, can Christians celebrate like Passover meals, and he says how the reason you can't anymore is because that was supposed to be like that was belief pointed towards like a Christ who was coming, and we say Christ has already come, so like to celebrate that, at least in the like strictly religious sense, would be like sacrament or something like that.
Yeah. So St. Thomas talks about, and this is actually a pretty good question. So the idea of like people, Catholics doing like Seder meals, right? St. Thomas says that external worship should be in proportion to internal worship. And what he means by that is that our external acts of worship should always conform to our internal beliefs, right? And if you don't, that's called superstition, right? And so he looks at, I think he uses the example actually of Seder meals. So he looks at Seder meals as this religious act that has at its meaning, that it's supposed to point to the faith of Abraham that the Messiah is to come, right? Which, if we were to celebrate the Messiah as coming rather than have come, that's an act of sacrilege, right?
So my question would that being, obviously people are still circumcised today. I think St. Paul said in one of his letters that to get circumcised, you got to follow everything. Is that still?
Yeah. So circumcision in the biblical sense is way different than circumcision in the clinical sense. So, I mean, not to get overly graphic, but so circumcision, like when a Jew is circumcised, a piece of the foreskin is removed. When, like, clinically, boys are circumcised now, they take all of it. So it's not even the same thing. I'm tempted to talk about that, but I won't. Okay, so then this idea of, hopefully none of you do this, but don't go participate in a Seder meal, because it's ultimately it's an act of sacrifice. It's just saying, it has meaning to it, and one, a little disrespectful to just like go to like a Jewish religious ceremony just because you're curious and you want to learn. Like,
So, question for you. So, what's the difference between going to so maybe you're about to say, what's the difference between saying, okay, I'm going to go to the Seder meal and like observing, or going to the Seder meal? Is there no difference between going, and if there is no difference, what's the difference? Why can you go, or how's it different than going to a Protestant or any other religion that's not?
yeah, so I would say that from the Seder meal standpoint, that's vastly different, right? It's making a different declaration of faith. And it's clearly a religious act, right? Like this is, it's going back to, again, not to get us really far afield, but like one of the reasons why yoga is wrong is because it's a religious act, whether we mean it to be or not, right? So we don't get to impose our meaning on the Seder meal. It already has an inherent meaning, regardless of what our intention is. So the second part of your question then, how is that different from a Protestant like prayer service or something? I hesitate to say, like, I'm not sure it is. Like, I'm not sure that that there's any real difference between, again, like in the old days, we would say praying with heretics was a bad idea, right? And again, not necessarily like that they're formally heretics, but there at a certain point where the church would say, well, no, we have the fullness of truth. It's much more effective for us to pray for them than with them. And then there's a move in the other direction. I mean, I wouldn't absolutely say don't do that, but I would say there are aspects of Protestant celebrations that are probably irreligious at best. Like to make a mockery of the sacraments, like that's not good, right? Like to pretend that to simulate a sacrament is a bad thing, right? Like the same reason you wouldn't go to a gay wedding, right? To simulate a sacrament is a bad thing. Now I probably would get thrown out of a lot of places for saying that, but I think that's true. I think that, when they have their Lord's Supper, that's just a simulation of a sacrament, and that's a mockery of something that's holy, right? So again, I maybe could be convinced otherwise, but if someone really pressed me for an answer, that would be my answer. Of course, I stand by what the church, if the church has said definitively and why, then I don't think she has, but that's my opinion. Yes.
What about like mock Seder meals? Like, so they did it at my school a while ago, where it was like, from my understanding, the purpose was to educate about like what the Seder meal would have been like, and a lot of them were kind of drawn into like how that's been fulfilled.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably nothing wrong with it. Like, I mean, it's no different than reading about it or understand. I mean, because it is still a type of the Mass, right? And if it helps you better understand, like, I don't see anything wrong with that. I think going to like a Jewish Seder meal or staging one would be wrong, but like for the purpose of instruction, there's probably nothing, and I can't see anything necessarily wrong with that. Someone else have a question? Okay. Yeah, I don't necessarily think. All right, so
what about there's a funeral, and then it's like at a Protestant church.
well, you gotta ask the hard question, Kelly. Yeah, I think I would be okay with that as long as it didn't turn into something that looked like a mass. I think I can't think of a reason necessarily why you couldn't go to. I mean, you would go to a secular, like if you're going to go to a secular version of the thing, I think it's probably okay.
I think Kevin's confused.
Yeah.
Say that again, Nicole.
Kevin's confused.
You said secular version? What do you mean?
Well, like, they just have like secular funerals, right? Would you go to a secular funeral where there's really not, where it's just like they honor the person and then bury him or something?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see anything like, again, that's really sad, and but I don't see anything like sacrilegious. And I think the same thing probably with Protestant funerals. In fact, I think as Catholics, we have an obligation to pray for Protestants that die because nobody else does, right? So really important. Yes, Keith. Just natural marriage, not a sacrament. Yeah, because it's a natural institution.
And then immediately from there, like, take the body and go to the grave. So would you say, like, you can maybe meet at the grave?
Yeah, I probably would skip that.
Even if they're like,
I would probably, like, if any way I could possibly skip it, I would skip it. But again, like, do I think objectively that that's like sinful? Not really, because the church isn't entirely clear about it. Would I avoid it almost at all at every length? Yes. But if push came to shove, I might go. I mean, there's certain lines I would draw, like never go to a gay wedding, right? Like, and certainly, most Protestant things where you would just go and be praying with them, fine, right? Like good, and good to pray with them. I think it's just when it starts to get close to the. I mean, the idea though is just convert all your family to Catholicism, then you don't have any issues, right?
Easier said.
No problems. Ryan, did you have a question?
Well, I guess I'm going to notice about the wedding being two baptized people when it's not a wedding.
I would be okay with that because they're still receiving the sacrament. They're still. Now, two Catholics who are baptized that decide to get married outside of the church is a little dicier, right? It's funny. One of my sisters did exactly that. She got married on a farm with no priest, with a woman Methodist minister, and I really struggled on whether to go or not. And I finally realized, like, I guess I'll go. I should go, right? And I didn't really. And then the day of, everyone in my house was sick. I was like, well, I guess I'm not going. Thanks for that. Wrestled with this for like a month. Would you object? Do you objectively know they're in a state of mortal sin? So something public and manifest. So like what you always do is like defer to that maybe they aren't, right? So in other words, you assume that if they're living together, they're not sleeping together, right? That's an okay assumption on your part, or that they went to confession beforehand, right? So like public and manifest would be like they're basically walking into the church going, yeah, like we couldn't wait till tonight, so we just started, we started early. And I mean, you have to have like definitive kind of when it comes to stuff like that, or else you kind of defer to the thinking well of the situation. Okay. All right. So Old Testament sacraments. Last slide. What I said was talked about sacramentals, which just is a little bit sort of timely. So sacramentals do not confer the grace of the Holy Spirit in the way that the sacraments do, but by the church's prayer, they prepare us to receive grace and dispose us to cooperate with it. For well-disposed members of the faithful, the liturgy of the sacraments and sacramentals, so the liturgy itself is a sacramental, and sacramentals sanctifies almost every event of their lives with the divine grace which flows from the paschal mystery of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. From the source of all sacraments and sacramentals draw their power. There is scarcely any proper use of material things which cannot be thus directed toward the sanctification of men and the praise of God. So that's the principle behind sacramentals, right? There is scarcely any proper use of material things which cannot be thus directed toward the sanctification of men and praise of God. All right, so their efficacy comes not from the act done or the act performed, but from the disposition of the person using them or receiving them. Okay, and they sacraments are instituted by Christ. Sacramentals are instituted by the church. Right? So the church, and so they have the power to make them or not make them. So the grace received from a sacramental is totally dependent on the disposition of the person. Right? And so they dispose us to receive grace. Yes.
I think it's probably answered in that last sentence, but is there a really like clear definition of like, oh, this is a sacramental? Because like there's some obvious ones, like you say a scapular or something like that, like a bronze scapular. But then you have, or like a blessed rosary. But then you have, okay, you know, I bless, you know, just can anything but like a candle that I bless, a blessed candle or something like that.
That is a sacramental, right? So the power of it, and this is why, you know, in the older rite, there was a big book of blessings, right? And each object had a specific blessing attached to it because it had a specific manner in which it could be used, right? So like a candle might be, you know, I don't know what the blessing for a candle is, but suppose the blessing is, you know, may this candle affect the light of Christ in all who see by its light, right? And so that the use of that candle would then dispose the person to receive the light of Christ. That very specific thing, right? So like a Saint Benedict medal, right? It's been blessed properly, really does dispose the person to receive protection against the demonic.
So is that a sanctifying grace or an actual grace?
That's an actual grace, right? So, but it may, I mean, in receiving the actual grace, like remember, actual grace has for its end, right, sanctifying grace. So it disposes the person, but it can be a source of actual grace.
Is it an effective source of actual grace?
No, because it depends on the disposition of the person, right? So Saint Thomas says the whole purpose of sacramentals is, he's like, well, we have all these things that, you know, all the sacraments have these specific ends, but none of them have as their end the forgiveness of venial sin. So he says that's what sacramentals are for. And forget in an indirect way by disposing the person. So is there a definitive list? No, not per se, because there's blessings for, you know, tons of things. But the take home though is when you ask a priest to bless something, make sure they use the proper blessing, right? Because just a generic blessing doesn't give it any specific power, right? Yes. I think that's a thing. Like I think that is, yeah. No, I think that's a valid thing, right? So like the blessing of a, you know, I don't know, kind of like a chicken or something, right? Like.
I've never been in animal blessing. Do they bless them for the sake of, like, I mean, is it blessing for the sake of the owners? Is it blessing for the sake of like the health of the chicken?
No, it'd be the sake of the owners, right? So it would be like, you know, like, I don't know what the blessing of a chicken is, but, you know, it would be, you know, so that, you know, may all this chicken's eggs, I don't know, fortify the, be a sign of courage for the owners. I have no idea what they are.
Part of it would be the health of the animal because an unhealthy animal does not make for good use.
Right, only indirected, like again, yeah. So, like, again, going back to like the proper blessing of them, really, it's not enough just to bless it. It has, each object has its own blessing, right? And so like a statue of like the Virgin Mary has a different blessing than the statue of, you know, St. Thomas, right? And a properly blessed statue or picture of Our Lady really makes Our Lady present, like to you, right? So when you gaze at the statue of blessed, it's been blessed properly, one of the blessings of that she will come at any time you need her aid. And so what gives them their power is the church. The church is, it's constant prayer from the church, right? Every time somebody looks at that blessed statue of Our Lady, the church on your behalf is praying to Our Lady to come to help you.
And so in that way, we would say where like the override blessings putting aside the questioning language like could be considered better objectively because they're more specific in what they're asking.
Yeah. So you listen to the blessing. Definitely, like a great example is the blessing of ashes, which are a sacramental. The church now uses two blessings, one of which isn't really even a blessing. Like if you look at the actual words, they're not really blessing anything. So we've kind of lost